Choosing a present for his son, the father gasped in shock. Around the vendor's neck was his missing wife's necklace, the one that had vanished inexplicably 2 decades ago. The sun was beginning to set behind the towering skyscrapers, casting long shadows over the bustling city streets. Daniel Harper watched the fading light from his small office window, his gaze distant, a glint of something unreadable in his eyes. In his early 50s, Daniel had a reserved, almost stern demeanor, traits forged from years of shouldering responsibility alone. Beneath his calm surface, however, lay an ocean of emotions, held back by sheer willpower, turbulent and ever-present. To anyone who looked closely, his face told the story of a man who had lost more than he had gained, a man who had held on to pain like a quiet but persistent storm. Daniel was a single father, and while he adored his teenage son, Tyler, their relationship was often strained. Tyler had been the bright spot in Daniel's life after his wife Elise had vanished 20 years ago. Daniel's life had split like a broken glass, scattering pieces he had never fully managed to gather. When Elise disappeared, leaving only a few scattered belongings and a trail of unanswered questions, Daniel was thrust into a solitude that no amount of companionship could fill. Since then, he dedicated himself to raising Tyler alone, offering him everything, but, as he often feared, missing something crucial that might have helped his son understand him better. Outwardly, Daniel projected strength, discipline, and a meticulous nature, qualities that allowed him to rise as a respected lawyer in his community. But those who knew him best understood the irony. His strength was both his armor and his prison. He rarely shared stories from his past, not even with Tyler, preferring to hide behind his stoic exterior rather than reveal the scars Elise's disappearance had left. This reluctance only deepened Tyler's curiosity and distance, leaving Daniel feeling disconnected and unsure how to bridge the emotional gap between them. With Tyler's 18th birthday approaching, Daniel found himself on edge. It wasn't just the milestone that troubled him, nor was it the thought of his son growing up and moving on, though that too weighed heavily on his mind. No, it was something deeper, a gnawing reminder of the promises he had once made to Elise, dreams they had shared about building a family together, and the heartache that now defined his existence. Birthdays always brought a wave of memories crashing back, and this one would be no different. He could almost hear Elise's laughter, see the way her eyes would dance whenever they talked about the future they would build for their child. Daniel's only hope now was to find the perfect gift for Tyler, something meaningful, something that might create a bridge across the silent chasm growing between them. Perhaps it would be a way to show his son that he understood, that he had been listening, even if the words between them had grown fewer over the years. As the light outside dimmed, Daniel stood from his desk and grabbed his coat, feeling the weight of another promise he had once made: to protect his family no matter what. How ironic it was, he thought, that he felt powerless to do even that. With that thought, he stepped out of his office and into the night, resolved to find something for Tyler that might, in some small way, make things right. As he walked through the crowded marketplace the next evening, Daniel felt the pull of nostalgia in every corner. The old streets were lined with a mix of antique shops, trinket stalls, and brightly lit storefronts, displaying handcrafted items that seemed like relics from another time. Despite the bustling sounds of laughter and chatter, the atmosphere felt heavy, like it was holding secrets. The warm yellow glow from the street lamps cast eerie shadows on the cobblestone, each flicker and corner a whisper of memories from years ago, memories he had buried but couldn't quite forget. This marketplace was one of the last places he had visited with Elise before her disappearance. They'd come here on date nights, wandering through the alleyways and laughing at vendors' attempts to bargain. She'd always been drawn to the stalls selling vintage trinkets, charmed by the idea that each item had a story, a hidden past. Now, as Daniel strolled past those very same stalls, the memories clung to him like a familiar weight, the kind that you grow used to but never truly get used to. The air carried a scent of sandalwood and spices, mingling with the faint sweetness of caramelized nuts being sold nearby. These aromas had always reminded him of Elise's favorite perfume, one that Tyler had found in a forgotten drawer years after she disappeared. The scent faded but still present, an unexpected reminder of her touch in their home. It felt as if the whole atmosphere of the market conspired to bring her back into focus, like fragments of her memory seeping through the mundane reality around him. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to clear his head, but her absence felt sharper here, as if every turn, every corner whispered her name. In one corner of the market, there stood a vendor with old books stacked high on a weathered cart, a sight that momentarily grounded him. Elise had loved reading, her bookshelf overflowing with novels and journals that she swore she'd finish one day. Sometimes he imagined he'd find her words in the margins, a trace of her thoughts preserved in ink. He paused, looking through the volumes, feeling a bittersweet calm wash over him. The market, with its familiar blend of comfort and ache, had always had this strange effect on him, making him feel both anchored and adrift. His hand brushed against his pocket, where he'd carefully tucked a list of potential gifts for Tyler, thoughtful, practical options he'd spent days considering. But something in him resisted each one, as though none of them were quite right. He knew, without fully admitting it, that this trip wasn't just about finding a present for Tyler. It was a chance, however unlikely, to find a piece of the past that might finally bring some closure. For years, he'd resisted the urge to come back to this part of town, but with Tyler's birthday approaching, he couldn't deny the tug of this place. A strange beacon that called him back, tempting him to face the memories he'd carefully locked away. The night was deepening, shadows pooling like ink across the ground, and the faces of people passing by blurred into a distant crowd. In the dim, misted glow of the marketplace, everything took on a dreamlike quality. He felt as though he was moving through a memory rather than reality, a timeless space where he might just turn a corner and find Elise waiting, her smile bright and expectant, her hand reaching out to him. It was a fantasy he'd long tried to escape, and yet, here, surrounded by the echoes of their past, it felt almost possible. Daniel was weaving through the bustling market when he heard a familiar voice calling his name. He turned to see Richard Talbot, a retired detective who had once been in charge of Elise's missing persons case. Richard's grizzled face, lined from years of working under the harsh city lights, softened when he saw Daniel, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or perhaps it was just the weight of memories neither of them could shake. "Daniel," Richard greeted, his voice as steady as ever, though age had given it a gravelly edge. "It's been a while. Didn't expect to see you around these parts." "Evening, Richard," Daniel replied, his tone a mix of polite surprise and wariness. He and Richard had spent countless late nights going over every detail of Elise's case, chasing leads that led nowhere, revisiting dead ends that only deepened the mystery. Over the years, Daniel had come to trust Richard, even respect him, despite the detective's blunt nature and sometimes disheartening realism. But they hadn't spoken in years. Daniel's decision to step back from the investigation wasn't something he'd felt he could discuss, even with Richard. "Tyler's birthday coming up, I take it?" Richard's eyes softened slightly. He'd always shown a subtle concern for Tyler, often sending Christmas cards or calling to check in from time to time. He had watched Tyler grow from afar, a silent reminder of the case he'd never managed to solve, and a part of him seemed to feel responsible for it. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, thought I'd find him something special. Figured this place might have, I don't know, something unique." Richard nodded knowingly. "Sometimes the past has a way of finding us when we're least expecting it. You know where I am if you need anything," he added, with a brief but meaningful glance. Despite years of silence on the case, Daniel could see that Richard hadn't let it go. Perhaps he'd carried that unsolved mystery like an old scar, much as Daniel had. As they exchanged a few more polite words and parted ways, Daniel felt a strange pang, a mixture of gratitude and wariness. There was comfort in Richard's presence, a reminder that someone else shared the weight of Elise's disappearance. But Richard was also a door to the past that Daniel wasn't sure he wanted to reopen. A few stalls later, he stopped in front of a makeshift jewelry display, drawn by a soft laugh. The vendor was a young woman named Lila, who sold handcrafted jewelry and silver trinkets. She had a way of speaking to customers that made each piece seem enchanted, like it held a story just waiting to be told. Her dark hair cascaded down her shoulders, and she wore a few delicate bracelets that tinkled like bells when she moved. "Looking for something particular?" Lila asked, catching Daniel's eye as he studied a necklace draped across a velvet cloth. Her expression was open, her smile gentle, and though she seemed familiar, Daniel couldn't place her. "Just browsing," he answered slowly, feeling a twinge of déjà vu. He glanced at the pendant she was showing another customer, a small sapphire in the center of an intricate silver pendant, strikingly similar to Elise's necklace. He felt his heart stutter as he glanced back up at Lila. There was something about her, an uncanny quality in her mannerisms, or maybe in the faint resemblance to Elise. It was subtle, but it was there, and it left him unsettled, wondering if life was playing some cruel trick. Lila didn't press him for conversation, sensing his hesitation, but her presence lingered in his mind as he left, a strange feeling creeping up his spine. With both Richard and Lila, the past felt as though it were beginning to close in around him, no longer content to rest in the shadows where he had left it. Daniel was just about to leave the market when something caught his eye, a glimmer from a nearby stall, something that pulled him toward it almost instinctively. He stepped closer, his gaze locking onto a necklace hanging around the vendor's neck, half concealed by the collar of her shirt. It was simple, yet unmistakable, a silver chain with a sapphire pendant set in an intricate, familiar design. His heart seemed to stop. He couldn't look away. It was the necklace, Elise's necklace, the one she'd been wearing the day she disappeared. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, and he struggled to keep his voice steady as he approached, his mind racing with a million questions, each one louder than the last. "Excuse me," he managed, his voice barely a whisper. The vendor looked up, a woman in her late 30s with bright, inquisitive eyes that quickly turned guarded as she met Daniel's intense gaze. She looked down at the pendant he was staring at, then back at him, an unreadable expression flickering across her face. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her tone polite but wary. Daniel took a shaky breath, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions rushing through him. The rational side of him tried to make sense of it, insisting that it must be a coincidence. But deep down, he knew. He would have recognized that pendant anywhere, the unique filigree design, the way the sapphire caught the light. It was as much a part of Elise as any memory he held of her. "That necklace," he stammered, feeling as if the ground were slipping out from under him. "Where did you get it?" The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. She hesitated, glancing down as though she'd only just remembered it was there. "Oh, this?" She touched it lightly, her fingers grazing over the sapphire in a way that made Daniel's chest tighten. "It's just something I picked up years ago. A trinket." "A trinket?" he echoed, his voice sharper than he'd intended. A flood of images swept through his mind, memories of Elise clasping the necklace on her neck, of her laughing as she tucked it under her collar when they danced in the kitchen. His hands clenched as he fought to keep his composure. I think that belonged to my wife." For a moment, the woman's face remained impassive, and then her eyes softened, though she didn't loosen her hold on the necklace. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice quiet, "but I'm not sure I understand what you mean. I've had this necklace for a long time. I don't think it could be the same one." Daniel felt a pang of frustration mixed with disbelief. He could tell by the way she held it, her guarded posture, and the evasiveness in her eyes that there was more she wasn't saying. The air between them grew thick, and Daniel's mind raced as he tried to gauge whether this was some misunderstanding or if there was something deeper at play. He looked her over more carefully, noting the worn, weathered appearance of her hands and a scar peeking out from the collar of her blouse, details he might have missed in any other context, but that now only deepened the enigma before him. The marketplace seemed to fade around them as his heart thundered in his chest. 20 years of unanswered questions, and suddenly here was a lead that had somehow survived the gulf of time. Daniel struggled to find the right words, to keep his emotions from spilling over. "I need to know where you got that necklace," he said, his voice low but firm, each word laced with a desperation he couldn't hide. The woman glanced over his shoulder as if checking for anyone listening before leaning in slightly. "Look, I don't know anything about your wife," she said, her voice barely audible. But if you really want answers, maybe it's best we talk somewhere else. Daniel's pulse quickened, a mixture of anticipation and dread filling him as she held his gaze. The simple act of coming to buy a gift for his son had taken a turn he hadn't dared imagine, and yet he found himself nodding, ready to follow this stranger into whatever past she was about to reveal. The walk to a quiet, secluded spot felt surreal, each step intensifying the whirlwind of emotions spinning through Daniel's mind. Shock, fear, hope, they collided in his chest, twisting into a sense of foreboding he hadn't felt in years. He could barely process what was happening, his thoughts racing as he tried to control his breathing, each moment stretching as he imagined the possibilities this woman might reveal. Once they were at a quieter part of the market, near an old, dimly lit alley, the woman turned to him, crossing her arms protectively over her chest. For a moment she glanced down at the necklace, then met his gaze, a wary but sympathetic look in her eyes. "Listen," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure what you're hoping to hear, but this necklace has been with me for almost as long as I can remember. I'm sorry if it means something to you, but it's all I have left from, well, a time I barely understand myself." Daniel's mind raced, his pulse throbbing as he struggled to find words that wouldn't frighten her or cause her to shut down. He wanted to explain everything, tell her that his wife had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only questions and memories that refused to fade. But the intensity of his emotions kept catching in his throat, as if speaking would make the pain more real. "Can you, please, tell me anything you remember about how you got it?" he asked finally, each word laced with desperation. "I'm not trying to scare you, but my wife Elise, she wore a necklace exactly like that. It was her family's. It disappeared with her. This is the only connection I've found in 20 years. His voice broke, and he looked down, ashamed at how exposed he felt, like he'd opened an old wound in front of a stranger. She looked at him, her guarded expression softening slightly. I understand," she said gently, "but the truth is, I'm not sure how I got it. All I know is that I woke up one morning with it in my hand, years ago. I was confused then, and I'm still confused now, to be honest." She glanced away, a distant, almost haunted look in her eyes. "There were things in my past, fragments of memories I couldn't explain. The necklace was the only part that felt real, something I clung to when I couldn't make sense of anything else." Her words struck Daniel like a blow, a kind of surreal confirmation that this was no ordinary encounter. The woman's story mirrored the painful gaps in his own, the sense of loss and confusion that had taken over his life after Elise disappeared. He felt a surge of conflicting emotions, both anger that she held this piece of Elise's life and sympathy, as if somehow they both shared in the same haunting mystery. "Do you think," he began, hesitating, "that there's any chance you knew her? Even briefly? Anything." His voice broke again. He realized how absurd he must sound, a stranger demanding answers for something that likely had no connection to this woman's life. And yet, the necklace in her hand told him otherwise. His heart ached with the desire for this conversation to lead to something real, something that would lift the fog hanging over his memories of Elise. The woman shook her head slowly, a look of regret in her eyes. "I don't know. I wish I could tell you. But if this necklace means that much to you, maybe it was fate that we met tonight. I'm sorry I can't offer you more, but if you'd like, we could meet again. Maybe we can make sense of this together?" A cautious spark of hope flickered inside Daniel, though he didn't dare trust it fully. He knew he was grasping at threads, but this one felt too strong to ignore. Swallowing hard, he nodded, offering her a faint smile. "Yes, I think I would like that." That night, Daniel barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, memories of Elise surfaced, vivid yet shrouded by the fog of years gone by. In his mind, he replayed their last night together, how she'd laughed, her necklace catching the light as she'd brushed her hair back. He could still see her eyes, the way she looked at him, almost as if she had something important to say, but had decided to save it for another time. And then, she was gone. 20 years vanished like a dream upon waking, leaving him with the faint scent of her perfume on her pillow and that vacant place beside him in bed, where warmth had always been. For years, he had wondered about the moments they hadn't shared, the memories they had never made. He had always clung to the hope that Elise would return, that she would come back with some impossible explanation that would make sense of the years he'd spent alone. The necklace he'd seen that night felt like a piece of Elise herself, something that carried her essence, her touch, and her mystery. It had become almost sacred in his mind, a relic from a time when life was whole and happy. And now, it was in the possession of a stranger whose past was as fragmented as his own. The woman, who had introduced herself only as Lila before they parted, had shared little about herself, but her story of waking with the necklace in her hand echoed in Daniel's mind. He replayed every detail of her words, wondering if there was a hidden message or clue he had missed. He couldn't shake the feeling that Lila's connection to Elise was more than coincidence. Perhaps she knew something, even if she didn't realize it herself. Perhaps her past held answers he couldn't yet see. Daniel remembered that Elise had always worn the necklace as a sort of talisman. She'd once explained that it had been passed down through generations of women in her family, each of them adding their own life's energy to the piece. She had called it the Keeper's Amulet, though Daniel had never asked why. Elise had hinted that her family believed it held protective qualities, a kind of ancestral magic that would shield its wearer. To Daniel, it had sounded like one of the many charming, half-believed traditions she'd carried from her family. Now, though, he wondered if there was more to it, if somehow, inexplicably, the necklace had drawn him to Lila. His thoughts drifted to the small clues he had uncovered in the early days of Elise's disappearance. He'd found only scattered pieces, a book of half-finished letters she had written to him, filled with expressions of love and hints at things she wanted to discuss but never had. And yet, despite his years of searching, no clear answers had ever surfaced. Every path he pursued had ended with silence, a haunting reminder that whatever Elise had known or planned to say had been lost the moment she vanished. Lila's story, however, had opened a door to a past he thought was closed forever. The next day, he made a decision he hadn't dared consider in years. He would dig back into Elise's belongings, revisiting memories he'd carefully locked away in dusty boxes. There might be a letter, a hidden message, a diary entry, anything that could connect him to Lila's fragmentary memories or explain why the necklace had resurfaced now, of all times. With renewed purpose, Daniel went to the attic that evening, searching for the faded, worn boxes he'd kept hidden there. Inside, he found photographs, letters, and even a few dried flowers Elise had pressed into a book. Everything was preserved as he'd left it, untouched by time yet heavy with memories. As he sifted through the tokens of his past, he felt a shift in himself, a spark of hope tempered by the bittersweet realization that the truth, whatever it might be, was close. Closer than it had been in 20 years. The attic was silent, the only sound the faint creak of floorboards beneath Daniel's feet as he carefully lifted a box marked Elise's things. It had been years since he'd opened it, years since he'd allowed himself to relive the fragments of her life that remained in the physical world. Dust coated the lid, a tangible reminder of the time that had passed, but his hands moved with a kind of reverence, steady and sure. Daniel opened the box, the scent of aged paper and faint lavender rising to greet him. He sifted through her old notebooks and letters, memories wrapped in delicate handwriting that bore all the tenderness he remembered of her. Photographs showed Elise smiling by the seaside, with young Tyler clutching her hand and grinning. Every image told a story he had once lived, but now felt as if he were witnessing someone else's life. He almost closed the box, tempted to abandon this journey for fear of what he might stir up in himself, but the memory of Lila and the necklace drew him onward. Digging deeper, he found Elise's old journal, one he'd only skimmed through in the early days of her disappearance. Her writing was eloquent and thoughtful, a window into her private reflections, dreams, and secrets. Daniel knew he had to tread carefully here, both to respect her memory and to search for any clue that could explain Lila's connection to her. As he flipped through the pages, his eyes fell on an entry dated only days before she vanished. Sometimes I feel as though I'm being pulled somewhere I can't explain. It's a familiar feeling, like déjà vu, but stronger, like a call. The necklace has been warm against my skin, almost as if it's alive. I can't shake the feeling that it's watching over me, guiding me somewhere important. The words struck him deeply, a sense of dread mixed with understanding creeping over him. Elise had sensed something. She'd felt a connection or purpose attached to the necklace that he'd never fully understood. The necklace, the keeper's amulet, seemed to hold more significance than he had once believed, something beyond the sentimental value he had attributed to it. It was as if Elise herself had been searching for something tied to the pendant, a journey she'd never had the chance to complete. Daniel's resolve solidified. He needed to know what had happened to her, and somehow he sensed that Lila was the key. Perhaps she was a lost part of Elise's story, someone unknowingly tied to the journey his wife had begun years ago. He thought back to Lila's haunted expression, the scar at her collar, her fragmented memories that mirrored his own. It was as if fate had intertwined their lives again after all these years, pushing him to confront a past he had long avoided. The next morning he called Lila, his voice a bit shaky as he left a message asking to meet her again. His instincts screamed that there was more, that perhaps she had memories buried beneath the fog of her own life, waiting to resurface if only they searched together. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what he might find, but the dormant ache of loss, the endless questions, these drove him forward with a determination that made each step feel inevitable. When Lila returned his call, her voice was hesitant, but he sensed the same pull in her, as if they were both drawn to a truth they could no longer ignore. They arranged to meet at a quiet cafe that afternoon. Daniel felt a strange sense of calm wash over him as he prepared for their meeting, as though he had finally begun a journey he was meant to take, one Elise herself might have wanted him to complete. As he walked to the cafe later that day, his thoughts were clearer than they'd been in years. The years of wondering, of trying to let go but never quite managing, felt as though they had finally come to a head. He knew now, with certainty, that he would follow this mystery wherever it led. Elise's memory deserved that much. And perhaps, in piecing together this fractured story, he might find his own closure at last. The cafe was quiet, the warm scent of fresh coffee filling the air, but the tension between Daniel and Lila was palpable. They sat across from each other in a secluded corner, both of them feeling the gravity of the moment. Lila looked uncertain, fidgeting with the necklace that had become the symbol of the mystery they were both tangled in. Daniel took a deep breath, steadying himself before he began. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, his voice low. "I know this must feel strange, but there's something about this necklace and your memories. I think there's a reason we've met." Lila nodded slowly, her expression softening as she seemed to absorb the weight of his words. "I feel it too," she admitted, her fingers tracing the intricate design of the pendant. "Ever since you stopped me last night, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. I keep getting these flashes, memories that don't quite make sense. There's this feeling like I'm supposed to remember something important, something tied to this." She lifted the necklace slightly, yet her eyes glinting with determination. Daniel leaned forward, his heart racing with anticipation. "I've been thinking too. Elise, my wife, she wore that necklace every day. It was passed down through her family. She used to say it had meaning beyond what she understood, that it was a kind of guide. She wrote in her journal about a pull she felt. I dismissed it back then, but now, seeing it again, maybe she was onto something." Lila listened carefully, a slight crease appearing on her forehead. "A guide?" she murmured, almost as if she were trying to recall something buried within her. "I don't know why, but that sounds familiar." They sat in contemplative silence, both realizing that they needed to look deeper into what Elise had known, what she might have been searching for when she disappeared. Daniel suggested they start with Elise's belongings. Lila hesitated, but the thought of finally understanding the mystery her memories held seemed to give her courage. Together, they agreed to go back to Daniel's house, where he kept a few of Elise's journals and documents that might hold a clue. Back at his home, Daniel led Lila up to the attic, the air filled with dust and the smell of aged paper. He pulled out boxes he hadn't touched in years, opening them with reverence, as if they held more than memories, secrets Elise had taken with her. Lila looked through the journals with a kind of silent wonder, as if each word might unlock a piece of her past. In one of the journals, they found more entries where Elise wrote about the necklace. Her words hinted at a growing unease, a sense that the pendant held a kind of power she couldn't explain. The entries were sporadic, a single line here, a paragraph there, like breadcrumbs scattered across the pages. But then they reached a page dated just 2 days before she vanished. I feel it more each day, the weight of it. The amulet has started to feel warm, and sometimes I could swear I hear it, like it's whispering something to me. I think it's time to find answers. There's a place I need to go, but I can't quite remember where. I only know that I'll recognize it when I see it. Daniel and Lila shared a look of shock, both of them feeling an inexplicable connection to the words. Lila's hand went to the pendant around her neck, her expression distant, as if trying to will herself to remember. This place she mentioned, Lila said slowly. Do you think it's real? Could she have been drawn somewhere? I don't know, Daniel admitted, his voice strained. But it's possible, and if we can figure out where she intended to go, maybe we can finally understand what happened. They spent hours poring over the journals, looking for any clue, any mention of a location or landmark that might have called to Elise. Their search felt increasingly urgent, as if the truth was close, waiting just around the corner. They found vague references to a lake, descriptions of trees that Elise had described as ancient and wise, but nothing definitive. As the night wore on, Daniel felt a growing sense of responsibility, not just for himself, but for Lila as well. Her memories, as fragmented as they were, might be the key to solving the mystery of Elise's disappearance. He couldn't help but wonder if she'd been drawn to that marketplace for a reason, if the amulet had somehow guided her there. We have to find this place, he said finally, his voice resolute. Whatever it is, I think it holds the answers we've both been looking for. Lila nodded, her expression determined. Then let's keep looking, she replied softly, and together they resolved to follow the trail, wherever it might lead. In the following days, Daniel and Lila grew increasingly focused on their search, spending hours going through every piece of Elise's journals, old family letters, and notes that might provide them with even the slightest hint of the place Elise had felt compelled to find. But as determined as they were, every potential lead seemed to fade, like water slipping through their fingers. Daniel felt his frustration mounting, the weight of years pressing down on him. Each dead end only served to make him question if they were chasing shadows, pursuing a path that might ultimately lead nowhere. Meanwhile, Tyler, noticing the time his father was spending with Lila, began to ask questions. He was wary of the stranger in their lives, uncertain about the sudden mystery that had taken hold of his father's attention. Tyler hadn't known his mother well. He was only a toddler when she disappeared, but he had grown up in the shadow of her absence, feeling her ghost in every corner of their home. And now, seeing his father invest so much time and energy into the past, into a woman who wore his mother's necklace, stirred a sense of unease in him. One evening, as Daniel was gathering up notes in the study, Tyler confronted him. "Dad," he began, his voice tight with barely concealed tension, "what's going on? Why are you suddenly spending all this time with her? And why are you looking through all this stuff again?" He gestured to the scattered papers and open journals on the desk, remnants of a story that Daniel had long kept hidden from him. Daniel sighed, knowing that he couldn't keep his son in the dark much longer. "Tyler, it's complicated. I think I've found something important. Something about your mom. Lila might be connected to her, somehow. I don't have all the answers yet, but I think this could lead us to understanding what happened to her." But Tyler's brow furrowed, skepticism flashing in his eyes. "This is just some stranger, Dad. You're grasping at straws. Mom's gone. You've said that yourself 1,000,000 times. Why are you dragging all this back up now?" Daniel struggled to find the right words, his frustration beginning to blend with guilt. He had tried to shield Tyler from his own unresolved pain over Elise's disappearance, tried to let Tyler live a life without the specter of her absence overshadowing every moment. But now, with the past surging forward, he felt the old wounds reopening, reminding him that the ache of not knowing had never truly left him. "It's not just about finding her, Tyler," Daniel said, his voice strained. It's about finally understanding what happened. I know this is hard to believe, but I have to try. For her, and for us. Tyler crossed his arms, hurt flashing across his face. For us, or for you. I've had to grow up without her, Dad. I learned to let her go. Why can't you? Daniel had no answer, his son's words hitting him harder than he'd expected. He reached out to Tyler, but his son turned away, retreating to his room and leaving Daniel with the heavy silence of the study, filled with traces of the past. Later that night, Daniel confided in Lila, telling her about Tyler's reaction and the growing rift that was developing between them. Leela listened sympathetically, nodding as he spoke. She knew the toll this journey was taking on both of them, and though her memories were fragmented, she too felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she murmured. Maybe this search has consequences we weren't prepared for. It's just, every time I try to back away, something in me won't let go. I feel like I'm meant to do this, like we're meant to." Daniel looked at her, a sense of camaraderie and resolve building between them. "I feel the same way. It's as if something is drawing us forward, even if it tears things apart in the process." They sat in silence, each lost in thought, bound by the knowledge that while the path they were on might be painful, it was one they couldn't turn away from. Tyler's anger and Daniel's own doubts weighed heavily on him, but he knew that some truths had to be uncovered, even at a cost. And despite everything, they decided to press on, committed to finding answers, no matter what obstacles stood in their way. A week later, Daniel and Lila finally caught a break. They'd been poring over Elise's journals, Elise's family records, and the few keepsakes she'd left behind. After hours of reading and rereading, Lila noticed a phrase tucked away in the margin of one of Elise's letters. The line was simple, almost cryptic, but it spoke to something both Daniel and Lila felt intuitively. "The lake keeps the memories we forget." It was written in Elise's handwriting, a faint scrawl as if she'd added it as an afterthought. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. The lake. Elise had often mentioned a lake, one she'd visited as a child, a place she said held special meaning to her family. But he'd never visited it, nor had he thought much about it after she disappeared. He only vaguely remembered its name from old family stories, Lake Haven. When he shared this revelation with Lila, her face grew pale. "Lake Haven," she whispered, her eyes distant. "That name, it sounds familiar, like something I've dreamed of but can't fully remember." "Maybe this is it," Daniel said, the intensity of the discovery making his voice tremble. Maybe that lake was the place she was being drawn to, the place she couldn't remember. He glanced at Lila, the pieces falling into place. "Maybe it's why you have her necklace." Lila nodded slowly, as if piecing together fragments of her own past. "I think you're right. Somehow, this lake, it feels like a place I've been, but I can't remember when or how. I keep having these flashes, a dense forest, water that's so still it looks like glass. It's as if my memories are trying to tell me something, but every time I get close, it slips away." Despite the uncertainty, they both knew they had to go to the lake. Daniel felt his pulse quicken, the need for answers overpowering the fear that had haunted him for so long. If Elise had left a clue, if there was something about Lake Haven that had drawn her, maybe this place held the key to understanding her disappearance. And perhaps it could help Lila uncover her own lost memories. The following morning, Daniel made arrangements to drive out to the lake, a few hours away from the city. Tyler watched him pack with a mixture of anger and resignation, and Daniel felt a pang of guilt but knew he couldn't turn back now. This journey was too important, a chapter of his life he needed to close if he was ever to move forward. As he and Lila drove, the road unfolded before them, winding through dense woods and small towns that seemed untouched by time. They spoke little, each lost in their thoughts, yet a mutual anticipation filled the car, a sense of inevitability that felt almost tangible. When they arrived at Lake Haven, the sight was breathtaking. The water lay as still as a mirror, untouched by even the faintest breeze. Towering trees surrounded the lake, their branches swaying slightly, casting ripples of shadow along the shoreline. Lila's face took on a look of recognition, as if the landscape before her was part of an old memory finally coming into focus. "This place," she murmured, her voice almost reverent. "I've been here. I don't know when, but I know I have. They walked to the water's edge, and Daniel's heart raced with anticipation. He could almost feel Elise here, her presence woven into the landscape. Everything felt familiar in a strange, haunting way, like a memory surfacing from deep within. And then, as they walked along the shoreline, Daniel spotted something half buried in the sand, a small, weathered journal, barely held together by its frayed binding. Lila picked it up, brushing the sand from its cover, and opened it slowly. The pages were damp and faded, but inside, Elise's handwriting appeared, as delicate and familiar as ever. Daniel's breath caught as he recognized the first entry. The lake remembers. I'm not alone here. There's something calling to me, something I need to understand before it's too late. They exchanged a look, the gravity of the discovery settling over them. This journal was Elise's, and it had been left here deliberately, as if she had known that somehow, years later, it would find its way back to him. And with each page they turned, fragments of her thoughts emerged, as though she were guiding them herself, leading them one step closer to the truth. As Daniel and Lila carefully sifted through Elise's journal, emotions churned within Daniel, raw and unyielding. Reading her words was like opening a wound he'd thought long healed. He traced the ink on each page, seeing her fears, her hopes, and, above all, her feeling of being drawn to Lake Haven. It was as if she'd foreseen this very moment, knowing that her words might one day be the bridge connecting him to the truth she'd left behind. With each entry, Elise's voice felt nearer, whispering across the years, echoing in the space between him and Lila. Her entries became more fragmented toward the end, jumping from thoughts of the lake's beauty to her fear of being pulled somewhere she couldn't fully comprehend. Daniel's hands shook slightly as he read one line over and over. There are things about myself I don't even know, things I've never questioned until now. As he read, a storm of emotions rose within him. Anger at Elise for keeping secrets, for vanishing without a trace, sorrow for the years he had spent grieving, haunted by her memory, and, unexpectedly, guilt. He wondered now if he had missed something, a part of her he had never fully known or acknowledged. It was a painful realization that Elise might have been carrying burdens he hadn't seen or understood. Lila, sensing his turmoil, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. She wanted you to find this, she said softly, her own voice thick with emotion. I don't know how, but I can feel it. Her words, they're here for you. Daniel's throat tightened. For 20 years I've asked myself why she left, why she never reached out. It hurt, knowing that there might have been something I couldn't give her, something that drew her away. He paused, his gaze fixed on the still waters of the lake. And now, here I am, realizing there's so much I didn't understand about her, even after all this time. Lila nodded, her own eyes misting. I think I'm finally starting to understand why I felt connected to this place too, like there's a part of me here, waiting to be discovered. She hesitated before continuing, her voice barely a whisper. I keep getting these flashes, pieces of someone else's life, like I've been here before, but as someone else. It's strange, almost painful, but I can't ignore it. They sat in silence, both of them bound by the ghosts of memories and emotions too complex to name. For Lila, this journey had become as much about discovering herself as it was about helping Daniel. And for Daniel, he was coming to terms with the harsh truth that Elise had not been entirely his to hold, that a part of her had always belonged to something beyond his reach. The more they read, the clearer it became that Elise had been searching for answers about herself, questions she'd buried until something had called her to the lake. Her journal hinted at secrets she'd been reluctant to explore, alluding to a lineage and history she didn't fully understand but felt compelled to pursue. Daniel couldn't help but wonder if he could have helped her. If, perhaps, he'd been too wrapped up in his own life to see what she'd been struggling with. He was now faced with the choice of either pushing through the pain of these revelations or retreating back to the safe distance he'd kept for so long. After a long silence, Daniel spoke. All these years, I told myself I'd find peace if I just knew what happened to her. But I realize now that finding peace means understanding her journey, even if it wasn't one I was meant to join her on. Lila squeezed his shoulder, giving him a gentle smile that was both comforting and bittersweet. Then let's finish her journey, Daniel. Maybe that's how you'll find the answers you've been looking for. Together, they closed the journal and sat for a few moments longer, gazing out at the lake, its still waters holding the reflection of the world around them. As painful as it was, Daniel knew he had to press on, to follow Elise's final steps. And with each new discovery, he felt himself shifting, his grief transforming, evolving into something that allowed him to hold on to her memory, not in sorrow, but in understanding. As Daniel and Lila prepared to leave the lake, a figure appeared from the path leading back toward the main road. The silhouette was familiar, imposing even, and as the man stepped into the light, Daniel's heart sank. It was Richard Talbot, the retired detective who had led Elise's case years ago. He was older now, the creases in his face deeper, his hair more silver than before, but the intensity in his eyes was unmistakable. "Daniel," Richard greeted, his tone firm but wary. He nodded slightly toward Lila, his eyes narrowing as he took her in. "Didn't expect to see you here, especially not with company." Daniel exchanged a tense glance with Lila, then looked back at Richard. "I could say the same, Richard. What brings you out to Lake Haven? After all these years, I didn't think this place would still matter to you." Richard shifted, his gaze hardening as he focused on Daniel. "I never let go of this case, you know that," he said quietly. "There were always loose ends, things that didn't add up. I wasn't the only one who felt it. You came here because of something you found, didn't you? Something that brought you to this lake, just like Elise." Daniel felt his pulse quicken. The intensity in Richard's eyes was unnerving, as if he knew more than he was letting on. For years he'd trusted Richard, even looked up to him, but now, standing here, Daniel sensed a tension he couldn't ignore, an unease that prickled the back of his neck. "Why are you here, Richard?" Daniel asked, his voice steady but filled with suspicion. "Elise disappeared 2 decades ago. There's no reason for you to be here now unless—" He let the words hang, daring Richard to fill the silence. Richard looked down, his hands clenched, before lifting his gaze to meet Daniel's again. "There's something I didn't tell you back then, Daniel," he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of a confession. "Something about Elise's case, things I thought I'd buried, but seeing her necklace on this young woman," he gestured to Lila, "I knew I couldn't stay away. The truth is, I never stopped looking, but not just for Elise. I had suspicions about her family, about things she was involved in. And this lake, it's connected. She's not the only person to vanish around here." Daniel's mind reeled. "What do you mean? She's not the only one?" Richard hesitated, as if weighing whether to reveal more, but the look in Daniel's eyes demanded the truth. "This lake has a history, one I didn't fully understand until after Elise disappeared. People talk about legends, whispers of families drawn to this place, people who vanish for reasons no one seems able to explain. I looked into Elise's background when she disappeared and found, well, it wasn't easy to confirm, but there were rumors. People in her family had disappeared before." The revelation struck Daniel like a punch to the gut. Elise had been drawn to this lake, not just out of curiosity, but perhaps because of something deeper, something her family had kept hidden. He glanced at Lila, her face pale as she absorbed Richard's words. Suddenly, everything they had been searching for seemed even more elusive, wrapped in layers of mystery that had spanned generations. Lila's voice trembled as she spoke. Do you think that whatever happened to Elise could be happening to me too?" She looked to Richard, her eyes filled with fear and a desperate hope for answers. Richard nodded grimly. "It's possible, Lila. There's something about this place, something that calls to certain people. I don't know what it is, but it's not a coincidence. It's like the lake has a will of its own, drawing those connected to it. And from what I've seen, once you're involved, there's no going back." Daniel felt his fists clench, a surge of anger and protectiveness toward Elise, toward Lila, and toward his son, who would one day carry this legacy too. He took a step closer to Richard, his voice filled with fury. "If you knew all of this, why didn't you tell me back then? Why did you let me suffer for years, waiting for answers that you might have had all along?" Richard held his ground, his face unreadable. "Because I didn't understand it myself. I still don't, but you're here now, and so is she," he said, nodding at Lila. "Maybe together you can find out what's really behind this. But be warned, It might not be something you want to know. The tension hung heavy in the air, a confrontation that had been years in the making. As Daniel stood there, staring down the man he'd once trusted, he realized that the journey he had started could end in revelations darker than he had ever imagined. The silence around them grew thick as Daniel absorbed Richard's words. The lake, a place that seemed so still and serene, now felt dark, haunted by a legacy that went deeper than he'd ever realized. Lila took a shaky breath, her hand clutching the pendant as if it could somehow anchor her. "Richard," Daniel said, his voice steady but filled with urgency, "if you have any idea what happened here, what really happened to Elise, now is the time to tell me. This isn't just about closure. Lila's life may be at risk, and I won't walk away without knowing the truth." Richard sighed, his eyes clouding with regret. "It's not an easy truth, Daniel. This lake, the stories I heard started long before Elise's time. Her family, the Havens, had a connection to this place that spanned generations. They believed the lake held a kind of power, a link to something beyond our world. The stories vary, but they all point to one thing: a pact or a curse, something that binds certain families to the lake." Lila paled. "A curse? You mean something supernatural?" Richard nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to the lake's still surface. "I don't know if it's supernatural or simply something we can't explain, but the Havens believed it. They spoke of the lake as a guardian and a trap, a place that held memories, lives, even souls." He paused, a shadow crossing his face. "Elise confided in me once, early in the investigation. She'd been having dreams, visions even, of a place she couldn't identify. She described this lake down to the finest detail, even though, as far as I knew, she'd never visited it." Daniel felt his heart clench as he processed Richard's words. "So, Elise was drawn here because of some family legacy?" Richard nodded. "Her family believed the lake chose certain people, calling them back, and they believed it could be passed down from generation to generation, like a torch handed off whether you wanted it or not. I think Elise was trying to understand that connection, maybe even break it." Lila's grip on the necklace tightened, her face a mix of fear and dawning realization. "I've had dreams too," she whispered. "Flashes of things I don't understand. And I feel like something is waiting for me here, but I don't know what it is." Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears as he thought of Elise, of the years he'd spent wondering, hoping. So she was drawn here. But why didn't she come back? His voice was thick with pain, desperation spilling into every word. "If she'd discovered something, why didn't she tell me?" Richard hesitated, his expression heavy with regret. "That's the part I never understood," he said slowly. "But I've wondered if maybe she couldn't leave, if whatever she found at this lake claimed her." The idea struck Daniel like a physical blow, his mind grappling with the notion that something could hold a person captive, binding them against their will. And yet, as he looked into Lila's eyes, he saw the same unease mirrored there, a feeling of recognition that went beyond understanding. Lila swallowed hard, her gaze fixed on the lake. If Elise came here and never left, then maybe this lake really does hold people, memories, lives. Daniel took a step closer to her, his hand resting on her shoulder, grounding her. "We're not going to let it take you, Lila. If there's a curse, a pact, whatever this is, we'll find a way to end it." Richard looked at them both, his eyes somber. "Just know that breaking something like this, if it even can be broken, may come with a cost." They stood in silence, the weight of Richard's warning hanging heavy between them. But Daniel's mind was set. For too long he'd been haunted by Elise's disappearance, held back by the shadows of his unanswered questions. Now the path forward was clear, even if it led into the unknown. He turned to Lila, a fierce resolve burning in his eyes. "We need to go to the heart of this lake. If there's an answer, I believe that's where it will be." With one last look of caution, Richard stepped back, letting them pass. Daniel and Lila moved toward the edge of the water, both feeling a mixture of dread and determination. Together, they would face whatever waited in the depths, knowing that the truth, however dark, was the only way forward. As they stepped closer to the water's edge, Daniel felt a weight pressing down on him, as though the lake itself was watching, waiting. The air grew dense, the world around them almost unnaturally quiet, as if even the trees held their breath. Lila's grip tightened on the pendant, her fingers trembling, her expression distant and pained. Daniel sensed the intensity of her fear, and it only deepened his resolve. No matter what, he would not let her face this alone. Richard stayed back, his face clouded with concern, his posture torn between duty and hesitation. He had been a silent guardian in his own way, and yet Daniel knew that if he turned back now, he'd never find peace. If he could understand what had happened to Elise, if he could finally reach her across the years of silence, then he could also protect Lila from whatever darkness lingered here. Lila's voice broke the silence, soft and unsure. "Daniel, if something happens to me, I want you to tell Tyler." She paused, her voice catching as if the words she wanted to say wouldn't come. "Nothing's going to happen to you," Daniel said firmly, meeting her gaze. "We'll face whatever this is, together." She nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the lake, its dark waters reflecting a world that seemed somehow separate from their own. A part of her, Daniel could tell, was slipping into memories she could barely grasp. He understood that feeling. The closer they got to the water, the more he felt the tug of Elise's presence, a feeling that went beyond memory. It was as if her spirit, her essence, still lingered here, waiting for him to find her. But as they reached the water, a strange sensation washed over him of dread, unlike anything he'd felt before. He looked at Lila and saw that her eyes were glassy, her expression shifting into something almost trance-like. "Lila?" he asked, gripping her shoulder. Her eyes met his, but they held a distant, haunted look. "It's like I remember this place," she murmured. "It feels familiar, like I'm stepping into a dream I've been having for years." Before Daniel could respond, a sudden chill swept over the shore, and the reflection on the water rippled, distorting the world it mirrored. The surface of the lake shifted, as if something beneath was moving, stirring up memories and images he'd thought long buried. He saw flashes in his mind's eye. Elise standing at this very shore, her hand reaching out, her gaze lost in the dark waters. The realization struck him with chilling clarity. This lake, with its serene surface and hidden depths, had claimed her, drawn her into its mystery. A wave of emotion rose in him, anger and sorrow merging as he called out to the lake, his voice breaking. "Elise, if you're here, if you can hear me, please tell me why. I need to understand." Leela clutched his arm, her own face wet with tears she hadn't noticed. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Daniel, I feel her. She's close, but it's like she's trapped, a memory in the water, stuck between worlds." A sudden clarity filled Daniel's mind. This was the lake's curse, its power, binding memories, holding people captive not as themselves, but as fragments, echoes of who they had once been. Elise had been caught, unable to move forward or return, her essence bound to this place, waiting, hoping someone would release her. Daniel turned to Richard, who stood watching from the shore. "You knew," Daniel said, his voice filled with accusation and sorrow. "You knew this lake held something, that it wouldn't let her go." Richard looked down, guilt shadowing his face. "I had my suspicions. I tried to warn her, but she didn't listen, and I couldn't bring myself to tell you then. How could I explain something like this?" Daniel felt anger surging within him, but it was mixed with resignation. Whatever secrets Richard had kept, whatever mistakes he'd made, nothing could change the reality they faced now. Elise was here, bound to the lake's dark waters, her spirit caught in the silence of the past. And now Lila, with her fragmentary memories and mysterious connection, was entwined in the same web, at risk of suffering the same fate. The cost of breaking this hold, Daniel understood, would be steep, but he was willing to pay it, to confront whatever darkness lay at the heart of the lake, if it meant freeing Elise and protecting Lila from a fate she barely understood. The lake stretched before them, dark and silent, waiting. Daniel's heart pounded as he stood on the shore, realizing that this moment was the culmination of everything he had endured over the past 20 years. He turned to Lila, seeing the fear and uncertainty in her eyes, the same fear he had carried for so long. Elise had been drawn to this place, her fate sealed by something he couldn't comprehend, and now Leela, through no fault of her own, was part of the same haunting mystery. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to accept the truth that had been slowly unraveling before him. The lake's power lay not in the water itself, but in the memories it held captive, the pieces of people who had been drawn to its dark pull. And for Elise, those pieces were scattered, suspended in time, just out of reach, The lake wouldn't release her on its own. It had bound her to this place, and she needed someone willing to break that bond. "Lila," he said quietly, his voice filled with resolve, "I think I know what I have to do. I can't let you carry this any longer. Elise's story ends with me, not with you." Lila looked at him, her eyes filling with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "Daniel, if you're sure, I'll follow you, but I don't want you to face this alone." He reached out, gripping her hand. "This isn't just about finding answers anymore. It's about letting Elise finally rest. And if I'm the one who has to make that happen, then so be it. I need you to promise me, though, that if anything happens, you'll go on. You have your own life, your own memories to make. Don't let this place take that from you." Lila's gaze held his, and she nodded, the fear in her eyes tempered by determination. "I promise. But I'm here with you, whatever comes next." Together, they stepped closer to the water's edge. Daniel felt a strange calm settle over him, the kind that came only when every other choice had been exhausted. The answers he had chased, the pain he had carried, all of it led to this moment. He closed his eyes, focusing on Elise, on every memory, every smile, and every silent moment they had shared. He poured every ounce of love and regret he had into a final call to her, a plea that whatever part of her remained would feel his presence. "Elise," he whispered, his voice soft but unwavering, "I'm here. I never stopped searching, never stopped trying to bring you home. If you can hear me, if there's anything left for us, come back to me, if only for a moment. And if you can't, know that I'm letting you go. You don't have to stay here anymore." The lake's surface began to ripple, the glassy calm disrupted by unseen movement below. Daniel felt a chill run through him as Lila's hand tightened around his, her breath catching in her throat. The water grew darker, its depths stirring, and Daniel sensed the presence of something vast and ancient. A pull that wasn't physical, but rooted in the memories Elise had left behind, the pieces of her that had lingered for decades. For a brief, fleeting moment, he felt her, a faint warmth, a familiar presence that enveloped him. He saw her face, not as he'd remembered it in his memories, but as though she were right there, reaching for him. It was as if time had dissolved, and all that remained was their connection, a bond that transcended the years and the silence. He felt her sorrow, her love, and a sense of peace that was almost tangible. Tears blurred his vision, and he whispered, "I love you, Elise, always." And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the warmth faded, leaving him standing on the shore, the ripples on the lake subsiding. He knew in that instant that she was gone, not lost, but released, her spirit finally free from the binds of the lake. It felt like a final goodbye, one he had waited 2 decades to say. Daniel turned to Lila, his face wet with tears but filled with a quiet strength. "It's over," he said, the weight of his words marking the end of a journey that had defined him for so long. Elise was at peace, and though the pain of her absence would remain, he knew now that she was where she belonged. With a heavy but resolved heart, Daniel took Lila's hand, guiding her away from the shore. Together, they turned their backs on the lake, leaving its mysteries and memories behind, walking toward a future free of the past's haunting pull. In the weeks that followed, Daniel found himself stepping into a strange but welcome calm. The quiet in his home felt different now, no longer haunted by unanswered questions or the restless echoes of Elise's absence. The memories remained, of course, but with a tenderness that was new, like the feeling of an old wound that had finally healed, its scars softened by time and acceptance. Each morning, he would sit by the window, his coffee in hand, watching the world wake up around him. The stillness that had once seemed oppressive was now peaceful. He felt Elise's memory gently threaded into his life, no longer pulling him back, but instead reminding him of the love they had shared, of the years that had been filled with happiness and laughter. It wasn't the closure he'd expected, but it was closure all the same. Daniel realized that the journey had left him with more than just answers. It had given him clarity. For so long, he had clung to the hope that solving Elise's mystery would bring her back, would somehow return things to the way they had once been. But life, he understood now, didn't work that way. Letting her go wasn't an act of forgetting, but an acknowledgement that their story had been complete in its own way. In finding her, he'd finally been able to let her rest. Tyler, too, noticed the change in his father, though their conversations were still hesitant at first. Daniel could sense Tyler's questions lingering in the silence between them, a curiosity he'd likely inherited from his mother. One evening, as they sat together, Daniel finally opened up, sharing with his son the details of the search he had undertaken, the memories he had unlocked, and eventually, the peace he'd found. "I always felt like she left because of something I couldn't give her," Daniel admitted, his voice soft. "But I see now that she was searching for answers to her own story. She wanted to know herself, to understand something that I couldn't have helped her with. It wasn't my failure, it was her journey." Tyler listened, his eyes filled with a depth of understanding that surprised Daniel. "I think I get it, Dad. I never knew her the way you did, but I think she would have been proud of you for going back and finding what she couldn't share." In that moment, Daniel felt a weight lift, a sense of completion that was almost overwhelming. He hadn't just found closure for himself. He'd bridged the gap between his own pain and Tyler's quiet resilience, creating a new bond forged in the honesty of shared understanding. Layla, too, had found her own path to healing. The connection she had once felt to the lake had lessened, the haunting memories of another life fading like mist in the sunlight. She and Daniel stayed in touch, meeting occasionally for coffee, sharing stories about their lives and the things they'd learned from one another. She had her own life to build, and yet they both knew that their brief journey together had shaped them in ways neither could fully express. As the days turned into months, Daniel allowed himself to embrace the simplicity of his days. The fear of forgetting Elise, of losing what she had meant to him, had melted away, replaced by an unshakable trust that she would always be part of him. His love for her had become a gentle presence, a quiet companion that no longer demanded answers or explanations. One autumn afternoon, as Daniel stood on his porch watching the leaves fall, he felt a sense of quiet joy, a feeling he hadn't felt in years. He knew now that Elise was free, and so was he. The journey had transformed him, leaving him with a newfound appreciation for the present and a renewed hope for the future. As he closed the door behind him, he carried a sense of calm certainty that whatever came next, he was ready to face it, anchored in the peace he had fought so hard to find. As time passed, Daniel began to forge new relationships, and in doing so, he also reconnected with parts of himself that had lain dormant during the years of grief and searching. People around him noticed the change, especially his friends and colleagues, who commented on how he seemed lighter, more approachable. He found himself reaching out to others, something he hadn't done in a long time, accepting invitations to gatherings, dinners, and events he would have once politely declined. Each connection he rebuilt felt like a step toward reclaiming the life he had put on hold. His relationship with Tyler blossomed in ways that surprised them both. Where before they had shared little beyond household routines, Daniel now spoke with Tyler more openly, sharing stories from his youth, his favorite books, and even old family memories that had been carefully locked away. Tyler, in turn, began to open up about his own experiences, sharing dreams, plans, and uncertainties. In these conversations, Daniel saw his son in a new light, no longer a child needing protection, but a young man ready to step into the world, shaped by both his mother's absence and his father's unwavering presence. One afternoon, while cleaning out old boxes from the attic, Tyler found an album filled with photos of Elise. He brought it to his father, and together they sat down to look through each page. The images told a story of love, laughter, and adventure, snapshots of moments that had once seemed ordinary, but now felt precious beyond words. For Daniel, sharing these memories with Tyler felt like a gift, a chance to introduce him to the parts of Elise he'd never had the chance to know. They laughed over her quirks, reminisced about the places they'd visited, and quietly acknowledged the holes her absence had left. "She really was something," Tyler said, a hint of sadness mixed with admiration in his voice. "I wish I could have known her." Daniel smiled softly, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "You carry more of her than you realize, Tyler. She's in the way you think, the way you listen, even in your curiosity. She may not be here, but she's very much a part of you." These conversations became a new tradition, moments in which they could honor Elise's memory without the weight of grief or mystery. Daniel no longer felt the pressure to protect Tyler from his own story. Instead, he embraced the idea of letting his son explore their family's history, the joys and complexities of it, knowing that Tyler would be able to find his own place within it. Daniel also began to redefine his own identity, separate from the roles of husband and father. He took up new hobbies, rediscovering a love for painting that had once filled his college years. The act of creating brought a peace he hadn't expected, a way to express emotions he hadn't known how to name. His paintings grew to reflect his journey: dark waters beneath vibrant skies, forest paths illuminated by quiet beams of light, all elements that symbolized his journey from grief to acceptance. His work caught the attention of a local gallery, and before long, Daniel found himself exhibiting his art, sharing pieces of his story with the world. To his surprise, the paintings resonated with others, each canvas becoming a bridge to people who had experienced their own losses, their own searches for closure. In connecting with others, he realized he was not alone in his journey. His pain and his healing were part of a larger story, one that touched countless lives. Through these connections, Daniel found his identity expanding, evolving. He was no longer defined by the search that had once consumed him. He was someone new, someone who carried his past with him, but who now embraced the present with open arms. For the first time, he felt not only the pull of memory, but the thrill of possibility. His life, he understood, was not just a tribute to the love he had lost, but a celebration of all he had left to discover. In the quiet hours of the evening, when the world seemed to slow down, Daniel often found himself reflecting on the journey he had been through and the transformation it had brought to his life. As he sat by the window or picked up a brush to paint, his thoughts drifted back to the lake, to the memories he had uncovered, and to the lesson that Elise's story had taught him, that sometimes love means letting go. For years, Daniel had believed that he needed to hold on to Elise with all his might, to keep her close, to make her absence bearable. He had chased answers, hoping that the truth would somehow mend the wound her disappearance had left. But now he understood that healing didn't come from knowing every detail. It came from accepting that life, with all its mystery and heartache, is sometimes beyond understanding. Elise's journey had been her own, a path she had to walk, even if it meant leaving him behind. In honoring that, he had found a way to honor both her memory and his own capacity to live fully in her absence. He thought of Lila and the journey she had taken with him, her courage and willingness to confront her own shadowed past. Lila's fragmented memories had given him the strength to confront his own, and together they had each emerged with a clearer sense of who they were. For Lila, the experience had been a revelation, a realization that she didn't need to carry the echoes of another's life within her. She could walk her own path, free of the lake's pull, and find meaning in the memories she chose to create. Their shared journey had been both a release and a reminder. No one could carry the weight of someone else's story, but in facing it together, they had found healing. Reflecting on these lessons, Daniel saw that life's beauty lay not in trying to hold on to everything, but in savoring the moments that mattered and then letting them be. He began to see his memories with Elise differently, not as fragments of a life that had been taken from him, but as gifts that had shaped who he was. Each laugh, each look, each shared dream. They were treasures he could carry forward without needing to chase the past. The journey to the lake had given him back more than memories. It had given him the freedom to cherish without clinging, to love without needing resolution. In his moments of reflection, Daniel often wondered what he might say to Elise if he could speak to her now. He imagined telling her that he had found peace, that he had learned to be grateful for their years together rather than haunted by her absence. He'd tell her that Tyler was becoming a man she would be proud of, that their son's resilience and kindness carried her spirit forward every day. And above all, he would tell her that he understood now, that sometimes love wasn't about holding on, but knowing when to let go. The lake, with its calm depths and hidden currents, had mirrored his own heart. In its mystery, he had found the courage to release the past, to let Elise rest, and to carry forward the love they had shared as a guiding light rather than a burden. It had taught him that the stories we live do not need to be tied up with perfect endings. Sometimes the beauty of life lay in its imperfections, in the questions that linger, and in the memories we learn to carry with open hands. Now, as Daniel looked toward the future, he felt a quiet strength in knowing that he was finally free. Free to remember without sorrow, to live without searching, and to embrace the life that stretched out before him. Elise's story had found its place within him, a part of his soul forever, but no longer the anchor that held him back. And in that acceptance, he felt a profound sense of gratitude for the love he had known, for the lessons he had learned, and for the peace that now carried him forward, one day at a time. As winter melted into spring, Daniel felt as if he were emerging from a long, quiet dream, each day bringing with it a new beginning. Life moved forward, and with it, so did he, carrying Elise's memory like a soft melody that played in the background of his thoughts. A song that accompanied him but no longer directed his steps. He was finally free from the ache of questions unanswered, ready to live fully in the present and see what it might bring. One weekend, Daniel decided to visit the lake one last time, not in search of closure or answers, but simply to say goodbye. The lake had been the silent witness to Elise's journey, his grief, and the mystery that had woven itself into his life. He wanted to see it again, to let it be a place of peace rather than sorrow. He drove alone this time, letting the familiar road wind through the trees, each mile lifting the last traces of weight from his heart. When he arrived, the lake was calm and clear, reflecting the spring sky above. The air felt lighter, the water a soft shade of blue, and the forest around him echoed with birdsong and the scent of blooming wildflowers. Standing on the shore, Daniel closed his eyes, letting the memories come and go freely, unburdened by any need to hold on or let go. He felt Elise there with him, not in the sense of a ghost, but as a presence, woven into the landscape, the trees, and the sunlight that touched the water. As he stood there, his heart swelled with gratitude, not just for Elise, but for the life he was ready to embrace. He would always carry her memory, but now he also felt the thrill of the unknown, the freedom to move forward, to make new memories, and build a life that honored both the past and the future. When he finally turned to leave, he felt a sense of closure that was complete, a feeling of peace that reached deep within him. The lake would remain here, a quiet witness to the lives it had touched, but Daniel knew he would never feel its pull again. Whatever connection Elise had felt, whatever legacy had called her there, had now been resolved. As he drove back home, a thought struck him, a warm, unexpected feeling of possibility. The future was his to shape, no longer bound by grief or guilt, but open to the adventures, joys, and challenges that awaited him. He felt a new lightness, a kind of hope that had once seemed impossible. He imagined the places he might visit, the people he might meet, the experiences that would add color and richness to his life. That night, he called Tyler, inviting him to come for dinner, and suggested that they go on a trip together, somewhere neither of them had been, somewhere they could make new memories. Tyler agreed enthusiastically, and the thought of the journey ahead filled Daniel with a quiet joy. He looked forward to the laughter they would share, the stories they would gather, and the bond that would grow stronger with each passing day. And as he lay down that night, he felt Elise's presence in his heart, a quiet but comforting memory that would walk with him, not as a ghost but as a gentle reminder of a life well lived and a love that had transcended time. He knew she would always be a part of him, but he also knew she would want him to find happiness, to let life fill his heart with wonder once more. In the silence of his room, Daniel whispered a final farewell, a promise to live fully and openly. He would carry her love forward, a light that illuminated the path before him, a legacy not of sorrow, but of strength and peace. And as he drifted into sleep, he felt ready, at last, for whatever new beginning lay beyond the dawn.